I'm your host, Shirley Paulson of Early Christian Texts, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study, we'll be talking about Israel Everywhere, the Second Letter of Clement. This Second Letter of Clement isn't really a letter, but it's some kind of communication that articulates pretty clearly an ordinary set of thoughts about a community's working on who they are. What's remarkable about it is the way it belongs to greater Israel. At the same time, it is so devoted to Jesus. Just a gentle reminder that donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. $5 to $10 per session is enough to keep us going. And you can find the donation link, the text we're studying tonight, more information about past and future study sessions, as well as other archived recordings on the Early Christian Texts website by clicking on the button on the homepage that says Tanho Monday Textual Studies. So, okay, Hal, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for leading us in this, and for the rest of you for coming. Second Clement is not very well known in the literature of the early Christ people of the first 2 centuries, but I have found it over the years having a really, for me, an important place in that larger literature, mainly because I think that it represents a whole major kind of movement in the first 2 centuries that was probably quite strong, but has not been similar enough to Christianity in our day to draw attention to what it was, nor is it radically different than Christianity, as, for instance, some other texts that get more attention. So I'm going to just say a little bit in a couple of stints as we get started, and we can gradually make this a conversation. As Shirley said, first of all, what I'm really quite interested in, and I think some of you may have noticed this in as much as you got to read it, is that basically all of the texts that are cited by Second Clement are from the literature of Israel. One might call it Judaism. By and large, I think that term Judaism is not quite used as often that early. But what I want to suggest is that this basically is a Jesus document, and it's a document that everyone who is in it thinks they belong to Israel. This is something that we can lay out as we go along. But first of all, let me say a couple of other just basic notions in the literature itself. Some of you know that I really love not knowing who wrote the text and the like. And this, we can really be sure that hardly anybody knows who wrote Second Clement. Now, the obvious question then would be, how about Clement? That was, in the late 19th and early 20th century, a pretty strong opinion. But over the last almost 100 years, there's been more and more question about whether a Clement wrote it. It seems like it got named after probably the early Christ movement leader in the late first century, Clement. There is a document that most people, I think, and I would tend to agree, that Clement wrote. That's usually called First Clement. Then this document that we're studying is called Second Clement, and therefore meant to be by the same person as Clement of the late first century. Again, I think most scholars and readers of this have now said, probably not. The really interesting thing is that nobody seems to have a good idea as to who might have been the author. So I've been mostly interested in saying, so what kind of person is this? And one of the first things I want to suggest tonight, as I've alluded to, it is someone who belongs to the people of Israel. And we will have some curves in that suggestion that unfold as we talk about this evening. But it seems to me that it's quite clear that these people act like people of Israel. That is, they give strong allegiance to what we would call the First Testament or the Old Testament, and that's what basically the primary authority. Now, there are sayings of Jesus in the text. Occasionally, these sayings of Jesus are identified as such, and sometimes not. So sometimes the author will simply say something that we know is in other documents a saying of Jesus. But sometimes the author says something like, and the Lord said this. Occasionally, the author will say, Jesus is Lord, or something like that. The author tends to prefer to call Jesus Lord. There is some use of the term Christ also in the text itself. And there I would probably suggest to us that that's not like Christ in the way that people today use the term Christ. Many of you know that the word Christ, or in Greek Christos, is simply the Greek word for the anointed. It seems most probable to me, and again, I'm quite sure that this is in some ways almost like a newly discovered text, in that so many things are less certain than they were 100 years ago about it. It seems to me that the word Christ is probably, again here, best translated the anointed one, and maybe even not a name. So because we think this probably has been written in the 2nd century, maybe even middle of the 2nd century, that is a time when people had by that time used the word Christ or Christos both as a name and as a title. So there I feel a little uncertain as to how to think about that. But one of the reasons that I like to think that this is probably simply a word that means the anointed one is because a lot of the concern for this text is that people stop doing the wrong things and start doing the right things. And if you ask the question, what are the right things to do? The biggest examples are from the Hebrew Scriptures. That's the righteousness of God. And over and over again, this text seems to say, yes, the righteousness of God is what we're all to be. So there's lots more let me say one other thing about the Anointed One. The Anointed One in common parlance in our day is said to be the Messiah. So in other words, the Messiah is, just to lay this out, and forgive me for repeating for some of you who know this, but the Messiah is the Hebrew word for the Anointed One. So it's a literal transliteration. Messiah, Mashiach, is Hebrew for the Anointed One. And Christ is simply the transliteration of the Greek word for the Anointed One. But of course, for people in our day, and I think to a certain extent of people in ancient frames of Judaism and Christianity, Messiah is a little bit more than the anointed one in the parlance of later Christianity and in the parlance of Judaism. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So in the Hebrew scriptures, there are three basic kinds of people who get anointed. So in other words, the anointed one would be someone who gets anointed, right? And by and large, the three main categories of people who get anointed in Israel are prophets, priests, and kings. So in other words, if you get to be a prophet, somebody anoints you. If you get to be a priest, somebody anoints you. If you get to be a king, someone anoints you. In Christian parlance, and maybe a little bit of pre-Christian parlance, there is a kind of proposal that Jesus is the Christos or the Mashiach, but in certain kinds of first and second century documents, that means it's only one kind of anointed one, and that's the king. It's interesting, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it also talks about Jesus as the anointed one, but it also thinks that Jesus is the priest as well as the king. So that term, Christ, I think is in the category of an anointed one, whether it be a priest, a prophet, or a king. Who Second Clement thinks this is a wonderful thing for us to discuss, because I change my mind about every other day on that. So let me stop here. I've done a little bit more technical explaining than we usually have, but let me stop here and see if there are some things you'd like to think about around what we've said so far, some questions, some disagreements. Those would be something that let's talk a little bit about in case you need it.
Well, I think related to this question, Hal, would be how does the word Lord fit into that conversation, or is that an entirely different conversation? Because I don't know.
No, well, why didn't I say that too? Good, thank you so much. Yeah, so the word Lord has a range of meanings in the first and second century. It is one way of talking about God. So for instance, you may have noted in the very first phrase of Second Clement, the recommendation is that you think of Jesus as Lord and God. You might say, oh, so that's what this means, is Jesus is God. I think it gets more complicated as the time goes on. Lord also is a term for someone who is ruling, even if not God. And also is an approximation of the term master. To a certain extent, master as teacher, but also someone in command of something or somebody. Well, yes, I'll just stop there.
I'll say that as I read it, to now hear your explanation of Christ and Lord as well as Messiah, I don't feel so bad about me looking at it from a kind of a social political perspective, as if he's trying to get a group to get in line, let's say, to follow these rules for living. And so, thinking about it from the second century, if this person is, as you say, from Israel, is it Israel trying to get the Hebrew people back in line under Rome? Try to bring order, using the words of Christ to. It makes me think of the evangelicals almost, using the words of Christ, trying to keep people in line for government religion. So to hear your explanation, it kind of solidifies what I was thinking as I was reading it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stephanie. And I do think that that's a real possibility, that the conversation going on between the author and the people that the author's addressing, again, we're not sure of either, but it's a real, since the teaching of Israel is so important in the text, it could be it's a person of Israel trying to keep parts of Israel in line. The main thing, of course, we need to know is Israel as a country or as a nation doesn't exist anymore in the second century. That doesn't mean that there weren't many leaders of what I would call spiritual Israel in the second century. And that would mean people outside of Israel as well as inside of Israel. This leader might be saying, oh boy, a bunch of Israel is going astray, and I need to try to get them back into line. And here, getting back into line, and this is where, since those of you who've read it, I'm really interested in what you think about that. I began tonight saying, I think that this is real Israel values. And that has to do with justice, goodness, holiness, and righteousness. It seems like this is mostly not some kind of sectarian platform, but basically regular old Israel. There are some really other things that don't fit into that. So we'll want to get to that as well. But this is a very helpful start. There's one or two other things alongside of what you said, Stephanie, that we'll also want to compare. But I think this is exactly the place where I would have us start.
So when you say regular old Israel teachings, why is that anything different from the teachings in the Gospels, such as the Sermon on the Mount? Isn't that regular old Israel teachings?
Oh, Joy, that's really fun. And so let's just take the Sermon on the Mount. By and large, the Sermon on the Mount doesn't quote Scripture, meaning Israel's Scripture. To some extent, but mostly the teaching of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount is in that vein, but also what we might call that wisdom teachings. It's short, pithy sayings that Jesus himself brings forth in the marketplace or in teaching on the road. Even in one part of the Sermon on the Mount, there's a series of things in which Jesus says, you have heard it said, and then he quotes regular old Israel, and then he says, but I say to you. So that would be more like a wisdom teacher who sees himself, yes, as a part of Israel in which wisdom teachers can come up with some new things as well. So I kept him within Israel, and of course there's no other place to put Jesus, but he thought of himself as belonging to Israel for his whole life, and so did the people who followed him as well. That's very helpful. Oh, and Ellie, I just saw you had a note pop up that's really helpful. You remind me that one of the ways of talking about Lord is simply the family name for the head of the household. So Lord would also be another way of saying you're the boss of the household. Ellie, would you like to say anything more about Lord and on the family level? You've done a lot of work on that.
Well, just that in terms of vocabulary, that is the most common use of the word that most people would, in their daily life, use. I mean, it's the most often it would come up would be to refer to the head of their household, the master and the owner. But also that's like on a larger basis, that's the emperor and Caesar Augustus and the emperor are also kurios, so it has that connotation too, but that's the head of the Roman house, the whole imperial household, or the empire itself as a household. So, but just that's where people would use the term.
Yeah.
On a daily basis.
And that's so important because, of course, a number of the Caesars, especially Augustus, started said to basically all of the empire, I'm your daddy. So that is, I am your Lord. So that is very important for us to see the combination of ways of using both the head of all of the nations that people know, as well as the head of the family. And then the Caesars bring that together and say, yes, that's right. I am the Father and the Lord. So let me go to the next stage, especially relative to what you said, Stephanie. There's one other big possibility, and this is, to tell the truth, one of the things that I'm most interested in what you all think. And that is, and just picking up where Ellie and I have left off here, as we said, and enjoy you and I even more. So Jesus belonged to Israel, was a regular old Israel person of one kind or another. He never said, hey, I'm going to be a Christian. There wasn't any such thing as Christians in his lifetime and for several generations after that. So in the aftermath of Jesus's tenure, the movements related to Jesus start also coming from the outside. That is, not people of Israel. But very quickly, for instance, Paul is an example of a person who basically teaches mostly to what one might call Gentiles, meaning all of the rest of the peoples in the Mediterranean. And that has quite a bit of success relatively quickly. I mean, it's not like big time success, like popular movements that sweep across the entire empire. But it's enough that the people who are not from Israel and not of Israel start following Jesus after his death in one way or another. And pretty quickly, it's a main idea that the non-Israel people who are following Jesus, in fact, probably by, let's say, the year 70, more people are following Jesus who aren't blood Israel than are. But these people that are becoming followers, various kinds of followers of Jesus, these people then say, well, we should be part of Israel. Jesus was part of Israel, and we're part of Israel. And so easily by the end of the first century, you have a lot of people who are not blood Israel. Even if of course, there are a lot of not blood. There are a lot of people who are by blood Israel who live in other countries around the Mediterranean. But even more now in terms of Jesus followers, those people are wanting to claim that they belong to Israel too. And in fact, that many of them are accepted that way. As Jesus people, they become belonging to Israel, and they do what you have to belong to Israel. Many of them are circumcised. Many of them do a special bath to be welcomed into Israel. It is true that some people who are officials of Israel say, no, you aren't. And they say, no, we're Jesus. Jesus was Israel. So we also are a part of you, Israel. Again, remembering, if you're saying, wait a minute, why is nobody saying they're Christian? We don't really know why they aren't, but they aren't. For at least 100 years, you basically don't have that, and I would probably say more. But here, Stephanie, is where the counter to what we were saying, that when we were saying this is an Israel group trying to get Israel groups together, to make them be real Israel. And now there's a possibility, let's say by 150, which is when we say this document would be written, by that time you have a whole bunch of Gentiles or non-Israel people, all kinds of other nationalities, saying we belong to Jesus and we therefore belong to Israel. So let's follow me as we followed Stephanie. What then if this document is written for people who weren't born Israel, but became Israel in their self-understanding because that's who Jesus was? And there what you would have, and it feels to me that in some of the verses of this text that we're studying, there I can almost hear this writer saying, you were Gentiles before, but now you got to learn how to be Israel. In other words, at times this author goes on quite a bit about, you know how bad you've been? You know how you're not doing the right thing, and you know how you're following other gods? That would be something that one could say to people who weren't born Israel, but are now becoming Israel through Jesus. So there it seems to me that that's the major counter possibility to what Stephanie and I were saying at the beginning, that these are real Israel people of Jesus, and they've gone astray as people of Israel. This other possibility is, since most of the people who are belonging to Jesus in one way or another 100 or so years after Jesus, and say we're Israel, and they would have to say, stop being non-Israel. And that would be kind of hard because you don't know everything that Israel is as you learn to be it. Okay, so that's another real possibility for this text. This text would be people working harder as Jesus people belonging to Israel. So here's where I love some arguments and questions. Christian theology, and I'm one of those guys, has too often forgotten that basically there wasn't such a thing as Christians for a long time in the first 2 centuries. And therefore, the possibility that there are bunches of groups who are from outside of Israel, but are now wanting to think of themselves as part of Israel because they're following Jesus. It seems like, for me, this text that we're looking at tonight has a real possibility of being a prime example of a whole bunch of people who have not been acknowledged, especially in the 2nd century, as a special kind of Jesus people. I'll stop here because that's a big mouthful, and love to hear thoughts, questions about this particular suggestion.
It makes me think of the argument between Paul and Peter about who, what does it take to be a follower of Jesus. because we can't call them Christians because, like you say, they weren't Christians, right? And so I think as you explained it, as I'm thinking about what you said, in the second century, if you were a follower of Jesus, you really were claiming a Hebrew religion. And I think going back to what I thought in the beginning, if you are claiming this Hebrew religion and you're claiming Jesus, um, they've got to keep you in line. And so, they got to keep the people in line, especially throughout the diaspora, right? Because now you're finding them all throughout.
Yeah.
And so you got to keep them in line. And so if you want to be a follower of Jesus who is acknowledged by Israel, then these are the things that you have to do. But it sounds so, I want to say it sounds so passive. It sounds so, do the right thing, be an alms giver. It's better to give. Love your enemy. So it sounds like they're keeping them in line with their faith, because the faith is what is causing them to get out of line. Because Jesus is a liberator, right? And so if I don't have to come to the temple and Jesus said, if Jesus is my priest, then I don't have to get the offerings. I don't have to bring a dove. If Jesus is my priest, do I really have to wait for you? Can I get in the baths myself? Or can I baptize myself? And so it just, as I was reading it, it just sounded like sounded like national religion almost. And again, it made me think of the evangelicals, keeping folks in line by using their faith principles. And if you want to be a part of Israel, then this is the way that you should act, and this is the way that you should live, if you're claiming Israel. But then the question is, why do they want to claim Israel? Because if Jesus came and Jesus liberated the Samaritans and the Gentiles, why do you want to claim Israel? So that sounds political to me as well, because you don't really need to claim Israel altogether to claim Jesus.
Thanks, Stephanie. You've raised a really set of important thoughts that I'd like to respond to, but let's see if other people would like to get in on this question as to who these people are who are reading this document.
I guess for me, a real newbie on all this, is that this is the first I'm hearing about the Christians, the Jesus followers, wanting to stick to Israel. I didn't realize that at all. I thought they went off to follow Jesus and those guys are over there. And this is the first time I'm hearing this. So this is an eye-opener. I didn't realize, because I thought that Paul had kind of nixed the circumcision business. So here they are going back and doing all these rituals because they want to be part of Israel. And I agree, after Jesus has said all these other things, why would they want to do that? So this is not answering your question about who's writing it, because I'm sorry, I haven't read it.
Oh, that's all right, Shelley. That's fine. So you're getting the stuff on the spot, and you're raising a really important question. And before I go back to Stephanie's material, it's related to what you're saying. So I want to just say one thing that is backing up why a whole bunch of us these days are saying we have to realize that there's no evidence that for more than 100 years, Jesus' followers were not Christians. So here's the main short way of saying that. If you look at the entire New Testament, the word Christian is used 3 times and means different things each time. And 2 of those times are in the same book. And there, it's contradictory. So, in other words, no one is saying, of the 27 people who wrote, or the 27 authorships in the New Testament, hardly anyone knows the term Christian at all. So that's one of the main reasons that a bunch of us are trying to rethink what does that mean. The second thing that is really close to what you're saying, Shelley, and I think fairly close to what Stephanie is raising, is this. The first thing to say about Israel in the first and second century is Israel used to be a nation, but Rome took it over. So it's no longer a nation, it's a former nation. And of course, didn't become a nation again for 2,000 years, or 1,900 and some years. But here's the other thing that's very important to think about Israel in the first and second century. And that is because for the several hundred years before Rome and Jesus, Israel has been conquered time and time again by other empires. Now, it turns out that Rome is the biggest and the baddest, and that's when Jesus is around. But even before that, there are several hundred years, no, even more, in which Israel is no longer a nation, and in many cases, the nations that have taken over, or the empires that have taken over Israel proper, have made a lot of the people from Israel who are of Israel, they've chased them out of the country. And so many of the people of Israel in the first century live all around the Mediterranean. So for instance, at the time of Jesus, there are at least several 100,000 people of Israel in Egypt. There are more people in Egypt than there are in Israel that are of Israel. And then what has happened in the several hundred years before the first century. What has happened there is that there are people of Israel almost every place in the Mediterranean. And because they're dispersed, they don't march to the same drum. That is, there are different ways of worshiping the God of Israel in those at least 300 years before the first century. So, for instance, the First Testament says you gotta come to the temple. But by the first century, more people live so far away from the temple, and there's only one temple, or almost one temple, that the people, let's say, who've lived for 200 years in Greece and still worship the God of Israel, they've had to rethink who they are, because they can't go 700 miles every week to the temple. And so what they have done is very creatively developed a way of reading scriptures of the First Testament, praying the way they thought they should, but that has all been in a way that meant that there were multiple kinds of ways of belonging to Israel's God. So, Shelley, I'm kind of shuffling the deck even more, of course, right? That it's simply not the case that the first century people of Israel all were on the same page. And in fact, so for instance, Paul, who also thinks of himself as Israel, but he doesn't want everybody to have to be circumcised, Paul sends money to Israel. He says in several of his letters, he says, come on, please help me send money for Israel to be Israel. Now that's a little bit of a complexity then, because Paul is saying to people, you can be like Jesus in Israel, but you don't have to be circumcised. Now that, of course, is where Peter jumps into the argument as well. Okay, so let's get some other people in here.
Are you purposely not using the word Jew?
Yeah.
Use the word Israel or people of Israel?
Yeah, and that's only, first of all, some of you know that I teach at among other things, I teach at a rabbinical school. So I know they're Jews now, and I like Jews, and I teach Jews. But as far as we can tell, the word in the first century is not what the people of Israel call themselves. They actually, by and large, call themselves something like, for the people of Israel, or Hebrews. So in other words, and the word Jew begins really just a little bit in the first century. There, the Greek term is Iudaios, but it looks, as far as we can tell, Iudaios in the first century doesn't mean what we mean as Jew, meaning everybody who worships the God of Israel. Rather, Iudaios means people who live in Judah, is a particular part of former Israel or conquered Israel. And probably there is, although we can't quite figure out what exactly Iudaios or transliterated Jew means in the first century. Not everybody's saying, or not even the majority of people are saying, who are people of Israel, they don't use that term. In other words, one of the things that I'm trying to do as somebody who studies this material is I feel like that we have missed a whole bunch of ways of knowing about the first century because we've imposed Christian imagination on that. So that's why I'm saying, who do the Jesus people call themselves? I looked through the New Testament and they're not calling them that. The same thing happens with Jew. It's really the end of the second century before Iudaios starts meaning what we mean.
So
Great question, Ken. Okay.
Can I ask you to help us bring together what this means in terms of, like, if we sort out the Israel and the people who are not called Jews anymore, people who are not called Christians anymore, and there's a relationship between them. What does that mean to us today as we're reading back into this? How does that sort out for us the way we understand the text, or how does it help us understand?
Yeah. Okay. So again, you and I get together surely every month and try to decide what we study. One of the main reasons I thought we should study this text is because it's such a perfect example of second century Jesus people who were working really hard to be Israel. And they knew that there were all kinds of different Israel. And there are many arguments between the people in Greece and the people in Israel about what it meant to be Israel and things like that. But that this is, you see, a text that is what I would think, at least half of all the Jesus people in the second century were trying to be. But we, as easily as possible in some of the second century texts, we don't get to see what I would say probably are all of these Gentiles wanting to say, no, we're Israel, and we want to honor Israel's God just like Jesus did.
So in other words, if I can think of a way to put this in terms of what it means to us today, we could say then that this kind of text helps us to understand the interconnectedness between the what we're calling the Older Testament and the New Testament, or in other words, where the shift came from and why and how the people are blending together and what that means in terms of our interpreting how we live. I mean, do we live by those texts or a combination of them, or who are they? So I think we're kind of looking for, what does this mean to us today?
What it means to us today is that I would want to say there are much deeper roots in Israel in the New Testament and especially in this text than we know, and that it will, if one is interested in figuring out the deepest values of the Christ people of that day, and maybe even of some Christians this day, a thorough understanding and honoring of the people of Israel is in order.
Yeah.
But that the model in the first century is a diverse Israel, an Israel which doesn't, and here's where, Stephanie, you and I should have another half hour to talk together, but I would want to say Israel in the first century doesn't march to one drum. It already is celebrating the fact that it's got people all around the Mediterranean who've learned somewhat different ways of worshiping the God of Israel.
Right. I think that's what I get from it. When we look at it, it wasn't one way of belief. It was so many different people bringing so many different aspects of belief to the Jesus movement. And that is what makes it so profound for me for present day, is because there is not just one way to look at the God of Israel.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and so if we look at history and we learn the truth about, it's important. If I took this text back to my church, and they would just go, yes, hallelujah, that's right, look at what he's saying, because they feel that they would automatically feel that this is a Christian. This is a Christian text. Yes, this is wonderful. But is it a Christian text? No, it is not, right? It's an Israel text of people who believe in Jesus or believe in the Jesus movement. It's still an Israel/Jewish text. And that's the importance to me, especially in a day now when interreligion is so important, that we have to see how it all comes together. This whole, figuring out who God is, figuring out who Jesus is, not just to us personally, but collectively, that it takes a whole lot to come to what we believe today.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. And Stephanie, you weren't saying this, but I have to say, having taught rabbis for the last 22 years, I keep wanting to speak in their voice as much as possible, in that so much Christianity has accused Judaism of being a narrow religion. I'll tell you, from my angle, when I'm going in and out of my rabbi students talking, they're some of the most free kinds of religion. And so reclaiming direct relationship with second century is part of, I think, Shirley, part of good health for Christian discourse.
Yeah. Man, how I want to say, I hope everybody takes a good look at the chat, because we have some wonderful comments here. Read what Janice Hunt Johnson said, read what Ellie has told us. Ellie's so right. She's saying that she'd enjoy a full hour of discussion on chapter 14, the rendition of the Christ and church marriage metaphor. Anyway,
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot here. We have 1 minute left.
Well, yes, and so, for instance, the same thing that in the last several months we've been seeing from the Gospel of Thomas, about the male and the female becoming one. That text is quoted 3 times.
Incredible.
In this, and it's really working very hard on what we were talking about regendering when we were reading the Gospel of Thomas,
Which will come up in our course when we get that done for you this month. Thank you for the plug.
Well, just to apologize for bringing such an obscure document that needs so much clarification. For you all to be jumping in as much as you can has been very moving to me.
Just love it. Well, I know we can keep going for another hour or two, or if more on this, and I appreciate your bringing things up. I want to remind you that if you have more things to say, please go over to the Facebook Early Christian Text Conversations page to continue the conversation, because there's a lot of things we could talk about. But I will end it up here. So I want to thank everybody for your participation and your questions and your comments. This was the September 2020 Town Hall Monday Textual Studies discussion on Israel Everywhere, the Second Letter of Clement, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, the Town Hall Center produces a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Dr. Hal Taussig leads the discussions, sharing a well-framed overview of the particular text, allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. To donate, simply click on the Town Hall Monday Textual Studies button on the Early Christian Texts homepage. You'll also find a donation button directly to the Early Christian Text so that we can keep on hosting the website. Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Hal. Terrific.